300 British soldiers are running at a hill, and most of them are about to die on it. It's the 29th of April, 1864, New Zealand. These are soldiers and sailors of the most powerful empire on earth, the empire that beat Napoleon, that runs India, that owns a quarter of the planet. For the whole day, their heavy guns have been smashing a small Maori fort on the ridge ahead, 30 tons of shell and shot, pounding one patch of dirt. By late afternoon, nothing inside is moving. It looks dead. So the order goes out. Fix bayonets. Take it. 300 men pour over the wall, and they run straight into a nightmare. The ground inside isn't a fort. It's a maze, covered trenches, hidden bunkers, firing slits at ankle height. The Maori defenders were never dead. They were underground, waiting, and now they open fire from holes the British can't even see. Officers drop first. The men behind them lose all sense of where they are. And in a few savage minutes, the assault of the world's greatest empire collapses into a panic, and the soldiers flee back over their own wall, leaving their dead behind them. Inside that fort were around 230 Maori. Outside, it were roughly 1,700 British, and when the smoke cleared, the British had lost 111 men killed and wounded. The Maori lost about 25. This wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't the first time. For nearly 30 years, the British Empire tried to take control of these islands, and again it slammed into something it did not expect and did not understand. A people who kept outthinking it, who took the Empire's own weapons, its own firepower, and engineered an answer to it that European armies wouldn't figure out for another 50 years. So, why was New Zealand so hard for the British to conquer? Start with how the trouble began. Because it began with a piece of paper that said two different things. In 1840, the British and around 500 Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi. On the surface, a peaceful founding document. Underneath, a landmine. Because the English version and the Maori version did not say the same thing. In the English text, the chiefs handed over sovereignty, full and final power over their land, but the Maori text used a different word, kawanatanga, governance, a lighter thing. To the chiefs signing it, they were agreeing to let the British keep order and manage their own settlers, not to surrender the land their ancestors had held for centuries. This isn't some fringe theory. It's the settled understanding of the treaty today, and it sits at the very heart of everything that follows. Two peoples signed the same document, believing it meant two completely different things. One side thought it had bought a country, the other thought it had gained a neighbor. And when the settlers started arriving in their thousands, hungry for land, the gap between those two meanings turned into a war. But here's what the British badly underestimated. The people they were about to fight were not, whatever the empire told itself, some scattered Stone Age tribes. The British came in with a story in their heads, the same story every empire tells about the people it wants to conquer, that they were primitive, backward, that civilization would simply roll over them. Every part of that story was wrong. Maori society was built on war, not constant slaughter, but a deep, sophisticated warrior culture, where fighting was an art, land was sacred, and defensive forts called pa had been part of the landscape for centuries. When Europeans first arrived, Maori didn't cower from their technology. They studied it, and they wanted the one thing that changed everything, the musket. Within a single generation, Maori had traded for firearms, mastered them, and completely rewired their own way of fighting around them. They weren't adopting European warfare, they were absorbing it and then improving on it. By the time the British Army turned up to enforce its version of the treaty, it was walking toward people who had already spent decades thinking harder about gunpowder than almost anyone alive. And the thing those people built to answer the British guns is the reason we're making this video. Here's the problem every army in the 1800s had and thought only Europeans could solve. Cannon. Massed rifle fire. By the mid-1800s, a European army could stand off at a distance and simply erase a fixed position, pound it flat, then walk in and take it. That's how the British had won 100 colonial wars. Bring the big guns, flatten the fort, done. Maori looked at that problem and solved it. Their solution has a name, historians call it the modern pa, and it was less a fort than a machine for eating an assault. Forget high stone walls. A modern pa was mostly underground, a network of trenches to fire from and move through, deep bunkers, roofed over with timber and packed earth, where fighters could sit out a bombardment completely safe. Instead of one big shelter that a lucky shell could wreck, they dug many small ones, so no single hit could ever take out the garrison. And the outer fence wasn't there to stop cannonballs. It was there to hide what was behind it, often padded with loose bundles of flax that the musket balls just sank into. One British observer watched them repair the holes in that fence overnight, every night, as fast as the guns could make them. Now think about what that does to the British battle plan. The guns open up. They pour 30 tons of iron onto the paw, and it does almost nothing because the defenders are underground, waiting it out. The British see a silent, smashed-up position and assume they've killed everyone. So they order the assault, soldiers walking upright into open ground, and the Maori come up out of the trenches and cut them to pieces at point-blank range. The historian James Belich, who transformed how this whole war is understood, put it in a line that stops you cold. He argued this trench and bunker system was a level of military sophistication not seen again in Europe until 1915, the First World War, the Western Front. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the Channel's job. That claim, that Maori essentially invented modern trench warfare, is Belich's argument, and it's a powerful one, but it is not gospel. Other historians push back and say Maori brilliantly adapted their forts to the new weapons rather than inventing something from nothing. So take the strong version as one respected reading, not a closed case. But you don't actually need the biggest version of the claim, because the results speak without it. And the first time the British met a modern paw, they didn't just lose, they were humiliated. Go back to the very beginning of the fighting. The far north, 1845. A chief named Hōne Heke had been cutting down the British flagpole at Kororareka again and again as a direct challenge to British authority. The war that followed brought a British force, with artillery, up against a paw held by Heke's ally, an older and brilliant war leader named Teruki Kawiti. The British bombarded the paw for days, and when they decided the defenses were broken, they sent their men in on a frontal assault. It was a slaughter. The defenses weren't broken at all. The Maori fired from cover the British couldn't reach, and in a matter of minutes cut down a huge portion of the attacking force. It was one of the worst maulings a British force suffered in the entire period, inflicted by a smaller number of Maori, from behind earthworks the Empire had assumed were rubble. This is 1845, 70 years before the trenches of France, and a British army had just learned, the hard way, that you could not simply blast these positions flat and stroll in. They would spend the next 20 years relearning that same lesson, over and over and over. Here's the part that really shows how far ahead the thinking was, because a European fort had one job: hold this ground, whatever it costs. A modern paw often had the opposite job. It was frequently built to be thrown away. Sit with how clever that is. A paw could be raised in days, right in a spot chosen to force the British to attack it. It would sit there like bait. The British, dragging their heavy guns, their supply lines, thousands of men, would have to stop, set up, bombard it, and assault it. They'd take terrible casualties doing it. And then, in the night, the defenders would simply melt away through the swamps and the bush, taking their wounded with them, leaving the British holding an empty hole in the ground they'd just bled to capture. That's exactly what happened at Gatepaw, the battle we opened with. The British took it. By morning, the Maori were gone. They'd won the fight and given up the dirt, because the dirt was never the point. The point was to make conquering this country as slow, as expensive, and as painful as humanly possible. And it worked. The British Empire was rich, but it wasn't infinite. Every one of these battles cost money, troops, and time. Every humiliating headline made the war harder to justify back in London. But the British had one card left that no amount of Maori brilliance could out-engineer, and they were about to play it. For all the defeats, the British had a resource Maori simply could not match: sheer, overwhelming numbers. In 1863, the governor, George Grey, launched an invasion of the Waikato, the heartland of the Maori King movement, the Kangitanga, an alliance of tribes that had united under a single Maori king specifically to hold on to their land and their independence. Grey saw that unity as the real threat, so he went to crush it. And the scale he brought was staggering. By the peak of this campaign, the British had something in the order of 18,000 imperial troops in the field, against a Maori population, men, women, and children across the whole region. That was a fraction of that. This was one of the largest concentrations of imperial military force anywhere in the Victorian world. The Pa were still brilliant. Maori still won terrifying defensive victories. Gate, Pa, among them, right in the middle of this campaign. But brilliance has limits. You can bleed an army. You cannot bleed an army of 18,000 faster than an empire can replace it. The British pushed forward, built their own forts, ground down the resistance mile by mile, and broke the back of the Kangatanga's ability to fight in the open. Even Belich, the historian who argued Maori won the Northern War and fought Taranaki to a draw, is clear-eyed about this one. The Waikato War, Maori lost, not because their system failed, because it was finally buried under sheer weight. And what the British did next is the real answer to this entire video. Because here's the thing. The British never really did conquer New Zealand the way you conquer a country in a storybook, one grand final battle, a surrender, a flag. That clean ending never happened. Some regions were never truly taken at all. The King Country, the interior heartland the Kangatanga withdrew into, stayed effectively closed to Europeans for another 20 years. Deep in the Urewera Mountains, the Tuho people remained substantially independent into the 20th century. And late in the wars, Maori leaders like Tatokawaru and Te Kuti ran guerrilla campaigns so effective they terrified the colony all over again. So if the army couldn't fully finish it, how did Britain end up in control? With a law. In 1863, the colonial government passed the New Zealand Settlements Act, and it did something the cannons never could. It declared that Maori who had rebelled, meaning Maori who had defended their own land, would have that land confiscated, taken, signed away by legislation, and handed to settlers. Millions of acres. Gone. Not stormed. Not won in a fair fight on the ridge. Taken with a pen from people the army had never actually been able to beat in the field. That is the quiet, brutal answer under the whole question. The Pa beat the guns. The trenches beat the bayonets. Maori out-innovated the most powerful military on Earth and made the battlefield conquest of New Zealand almost impossible. So the empire stopped trying to win it on the battlefield and won it in a courthouse instead. So, why was New Zealand so hard for the British to conquer? Because the people defending it were better at war than the empire ever admitted. They took a problem every European army thought only Europeans could solve: how to survive massed artillery, and they solved it first, in the dirt, with trenches and bunkers and flax and nerve. They turned their own forts into traps. They made the most powerful army in the world pay in blood for every hill, and sometimes handed the hill straight back the next morning because they understood something the British didn't, that the goal was never to hold the ground. It was to make holding the ground cost more than it was worth. And they were so good at it that in the end, the empire couldn't finish the job with soldiers. It had to reach for lawyers and land acts and confiscation, a slower, colder kind of conquest, aimed at the thing the army could never capture: the connection between a people and their land. For decades, the story that got told was the empire's story: brave British troops, inevitable British victory, a country handed over by treaty. It took historians like James Belich, more than a century later, to go back to the records and show how much of that was a lie the winners told themselves, that in battle after battle, the empire hadn't won at all. Sometimes it had been beaten so badly that the history books just quietly changed who was said to have won. The Pa are still out there, grass-covered ridges and ditches in quiet New Zealand fields, where a couple of hundred people once stood in the mud and stopped an empire's assault dead, and where, 70 years before the world called it a new kind of horror, someone had already looked at modern war and figured out how to survive it. The British took the land. They never did conquer the people who taught them that.